Just to say good morning, everybody. And aren't you great to get here through the spot of rain we're having? As if we didn't know how to deal with the spot of rain in this country. And indeed we do. But look, it truly is a real pleasure to see you all here. And it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much, Nadine, and everybody involved with the wonderful IGHN conference. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. Although I have to say, I do feel quite nervous because I'm an activist and a campaigner. I am absolutely not a health expert, but I think some of you at least will know that already. But I think especially delighted and pleased to be here because when, looking around, I see a space which is just packed with amazing women, strong women, from many different groups and communities and political perspectives and experiences and all kinds of diverse situations and circumstances, all very skilled and effective and very determined in what you do. And I think that that's so important, how powerful we are when we come together like this to discuss, to debate, and sometimes, even quite often, to disagree, and above all, to actually flex our thinking muscles. And in doing that, to recognize our power and our capacity as women, all the better to confront and to fight against and to overcome the very real difficulties that we're facing at the present time. So I'm going to start from what I know best. So I'm actually going to be quite personal. And before I finish, I want to very briefly outline some of the kind of big picture threats and risks which I think are impacting negatively on women's health and overall well-being. So I can tell you that I have been a feminist since the mid-1970s, and I still am, because despite decades of struggle, all through my adult life, far from having been shifted off the stage, patriarchal hierarchy is still a major organizing system of power, control, and oppression, a clear and very present danger, which I think is gaining in strength again today. Patriarchy does not, of course, function alone. It's wound up into other power systems, including capitalism, or so-called late capitalism, although I think that feels like wishful thinking to me. It doesn't look late, it still looks rather domineering and vigorous. It's wound up with racism, with neocolonialism, with homo and lesbo and transphobia, with ableism, with ageism, and with so much more. And although there are major inequalities between us, I think it's fair to say that the majority of women still do not enjoy our full and rightful place in the sun. For women, gender makes a major difference in and to our lives and our health, whoever, wherever we are. And that's not the way it is for men. When we say gender, we typically think of women. And policymakers and service providers typically think of women. Men apparently don't have gender. They're gender-free. They are the default, the template, the model of a human person. However, while our gender is a central defining factor in our lives as women, it's always part of a very complicated mix: social, sexual, economic, physical, geographical, and so on, which actually goes to make up our identity, our sense of who we are. There is a lot that we share as women, and a lot also which differentiates us from one another. That word that we use so much at the moment, intersectionality, it's not just a word, it's not just a concept, it's not just an idea, and it is not just about difference. It's a very itself complex set of real everyday factors which position us at unequal points, higher or lower, more or less well, on the power, health, and well-being pyramid. Social class, ethnicity, skin color, disability, age, sexual and gender identity, geography are all powerful social markers, among others. So the second thing I want to say here is that we don't always actually take geography sufficiently into account. Where in the world you are born and where you live also incredibly strongly determine your life, your health, and your well-being chances. And I'm thinking, of course, of the global north, global south divide. For women in the global north, geography is an asset. It means higher quality of life, better maternal health, higher life expectancy, better access to healthcare, more equality, and human rights protection, particularly in Europe. In Europe, we live, however unequally between us, in the rich, healthy, and more equal part of the world. But looking back at myself as a girl and a young woman, growing up in that very bleak, terrifying place, Holy Catholic Ireland, capitalist but pre-consumerist, very poor, very isolated. No Ryanair, no internet, no social media, no divorce, no single parent allowance, no contraception, no abortion. That place where not to marry and to spend our time raising our children and looking after our men was stigmatized, and also very difficult for the very many women who had to combine all that looking after with low-paid work, usually part-time, to ensure family survival. That same Ireland, where I never heard the word lesbian and barely knew about gay men, and no one, but no one, ever talked about men's violence against women. There wasn't even a word for it, or indeed didn't talk about rape. Sometimes I wonder how we survived our lives at all, and the sad reality is that, of course, very many women didn't, and very many women had very desolate and desperate lives. But, and this is very important, I'm speaking very personally, I was a very privileged young woman, white, settled, European, with a good education, a degree, okay, first girl in my extended family, but nevertheless, with the prospect of a well-paid, interesting job. Career was not a word which featured in my vocabulary, but I knew that I would do paid work. I had a home of my own in my 20s on a very basic academic salary. Can you imagine that now? In my 20s, bought, well, mortgaged with my own money. That's unthinkable now. So I had the home of my own, and I also got married. And then it all fell apart. It didn't work. I became very ill in my 20s with severe anorexia and suicidal depression, and spent the next 5-6 years in and out of a psychiatric hospital, barely holding on to my job in UCD by the skin of my teeth. I was desolate and lost, and I had no idea why it had all fallen apart. But then feminism and the women's liberation movement burst into my life in the 1970s, and truly, I can't say it saved me. Feminism taught me to ask why and to look beyond myself for an explanation of the social systems and structures that functioned to keep me in a state of depression and oppression. I had been educated, on the whole, to be independent and to earn my living, but I found myself now in a headlong collision with a system which wanted me to be subordinate. That had to change. In fact, I have to tell you, my marriage lasted 6 months, which at that time was kind of a record. We had no divorce. But I found feminism, if I can put it like that, because of my privilege, the privilege of my social class, education, and so on and so forth. Although it took me years to realize that whenever I say I am a woman, I am actually erasing aspects and parts of myself that have been fundamental to shaping who and what I am, what I can do, and to determining my health and my well-being in the world. I was not, and never am, just a woman. My gender was not an asset, for sure, even less so when I realized I was lesbian or queer. But my social class, my skin color, my geography, my education, my job, everything really in my life have given me massive, entirely unearned and lifelong advantages and protections. My privileges reinforced one another and accumulated throughout my life to keep me relatively safe and well, barring accidents, and I have to admit quite a lot of mistakes, and with more than a sufficient supply of the necessities for human flourishing, each one fundamental to my health: good food, a home, education, access to physical and mental health care, a steady wage, and now, very importantly, a pension, family, friends, and community, several communities, access to culture, a social life, all of those things that make up a life and that are necessary to our well-being. I've been lucky not to have had a disability or a chronic condition until quite late in my life. I have a few problems now because I'll be 80 in a few months' time. Although I want to say that service provision and care of older people in this country is absolutely disgraceful. And the consequences of lifespan gender inequality for women mean that aging is very challenging and difficult in so many cases. We need to call that out and to fight it. Of course, we want to focus on young women, on girls, but let's remember the other end of the age spectrum. I also want to remind everybody here that the minute you're born, you're aging, so never forget that. I've survived pretty well, and I'm incredibly fortunate to be privileged. I know that, but I object to privilege. The wonderful Virginia Woolf said, more or less, there would be nothing wrong with privilege if everyone could have it. But that is exactly the point, isn't it? Everyone doesn't have it. It's random. And we need to radically transform and eliminate the socioeconomic systems which destine some to good health, to well-being, to live lives of relative happiness, and that relegates others to struggle, distress, inequality, and profound injustice, which is why I am still a feminist and a socialist. I haven't quite finished, not off the hook yet. I want to turn and I will be brief, to talk about some of the key risks and threats for women and our health and well-being at the present time. They're very tough times. Cost of living, we heard, gone up by 11% just this year. That's massive. And that's just the very tip of the iceberg. And of course, it's toughest of all for those who have least. And we need to have a very clear analysis of what's happening so that we can take action for change. We've made uneven, but all the same, very significant steps towards women's equality and well-being over my lifetime. But we're now in a period of actual and potential reversal and regression of women's rights and freedoms. And they were, many of us took them for granted, including that equality would somehow grow and spread to encompass wider and wider groups of women. All of that is now under threat, or a lot of it is under threat, or already has been disappeared. And it's very important to remind ourselves that the power systems that we're actually up against are hugely connected. They're designed to maintain and to strengthen existing power relations. They're very resistant to reconfiguration and to change, and to the equal distribution of power and wealth. So I'm just going to outline some of these challenges, and it's absolutely in shorthand because otherwise we'd be here for the rest of the day, and you certainly don't want that. I want first to mention a very basic ongoing threat to women's health, which is the continuing failures within health and medical research and practice to look seriously at the difference that women's gender makes. Caroline Criado Perez puts this very, very well in her excellent and also absolutely enraging book, Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, when she says, we need a revolution in the research and the practice of medicine. It's time for doctors to stop dismissing women and to start saving them. And before I look at the challenges and go on to look at them, I just want to say that there was good news the other day where the European Parliament's gender equality strategy actually now contains a commitment to working for, within the EU, gender-responsive healthcare. And that doesn't mean men, because remember, they don't have gender. That means our healthcare as women and girls. I suppose the first, it's no particular order, but I begin with that political shift to the right, which involves a rise in misogyny and in homo and transphobia and many other things besides. It's more than a drift, it's accelerating, including here in Europe. In, at least 7 European countries, EU countries, now have very or extreme right-wing governments, while others, including Sweden, including France, including Germany, are moving rightwards at quite a pace. The EU Parliament itself took quite a sharp turn in the last European elections, resulting, among other things, in the abject failure to condemn promptly, if indeed it did so, if indeed it were to do so full-heartedly, to condemn Palestinian genocide. And I want to say to all of you, I stand for a free Palestine, absolutely. I hardly, in that shift, move to the right, need to mention Trump, one reversal after another of women's, LGBTIQ, migrant, and many other minority rights. But there's also Modi in India, Duterte now shifted to Marcos again in the Philippines, and many other countries that we could cite that have definitely moved rightwards. Neo-fascism and extremism are far more prominent, active and disruptive. That is their aim, to disrupt, while their impact is being amplified immeasurably by toxic, hate-driven social media. And the point is that right-wing governments are very bad for women historically and for other minority and marginalized groups. Health and social care and supports are the first to go, while the tropes of extreme right politics are not only racist and anti-migrant, but are deeply misogynist and transphobic. We're seeing much more explicit and coordinated misogyny and so on. Trans women especially are relentlessly targeted. And we're seeing, as we know, in the USA, stunning reversals of rights, almost on a kind of weekly basis. So this is a very volatile political situation and a very dangerous one for women and minority groups in particular. And it is making centre and centre-right, and even centre-left, some centre-left governments everywhere, far more cautious. I always think here over the past 6 to 12 months of what is a situation now in the UK, where there is what I would call a conservative Labour Party, which does not see that actually equality is something which must be defended and fought for and invested in, and that women's and minority rights really matter very centrally. There are chinks of light. Let me say that in Ireland, we have just elected a wonderful president, and I would like to hear a big cheer. And that really is, I think, an indication not of the reality of our policies, but of the truth of our aspirations to be a more egalitarian, just, fair, open, and warm country. We have also seen other moves that are quite positive. There in the Netherlands, for example, the extreme right has been pushed aside. In the USA, we saw the election of Zoran Mamdani as mayor of New York, and so on and so forth. But overall, we're dealing with a difficult situation. The second point I want to mention specifically is poverty. Since COVID, globally, poverty has ceased to decline. That is to say, it's stalling. And in some instances, we can see it rising. Now, as one of the most important causes or drivers of ill health, this is a disaster for women, for children, and for marginalised groups. And following hot on the heels of poverty are migration and displacement. Migration is rising, and so too is internal displacement within countries. I'm thinking of Sudan, for example, which is now at historic levels, largely because of war and conflict, intolerable poverty, and environmental and climate disasters. The Philippines, last week, just struck by the 21st typhoon this year, is on its knees. Apart from the trauma of migration itself, it has particular gendered impacts for women. It exacerbates gender inequalities. It dramatically increases women's vulnerability to violence and exploitation. And of course, it adds immeasurably to women's care work and other labour burdens. And that's the case, whether it's internal displacement or migration to another country, including in Europe. And of course, racist violence towards migrants has increased throughout Europe, and here in Ireland, where sickeningly, extremists tried to burn women and children out of their lodgings just 2 weeks ago. I mean, how shameful, how appalling, how inhuman is that? And how can we not rise up against that happening in the country that we live in, where we have elected a president who does not share those views? On the contrary, we have to live up to those values and those principles. Thirdly, I want to mention war and militarization. The world is without doubt becoming more bellicose. Armed conflicts, the number of armed conflicts globally is at its highest since the end of the Second World War, so-called World War, with appalling consequences for women, for children, and for all vulnerable groups. There is the continuing horror of Palestinian genocide in Gaza, where an utterly shocking 70% of war dead are women and children. It is hard to look at that without weeping and without lamenting the cowardice of governments globally to stop that happening. While the terrible war in Sudan has been described as a war on the bodies of women and girls, with rampant rape and other forms of sexual violence, before we've even begun to count the dead from famine, drought, displacement, and so on. The ramping up of militarization and arms buying here in Europe, which is precisely why Irish neutrality really matters, has consequences. It puts the world on a war-ready footing, which means immediately less money for health and social care, less money to ensure food security, less money for shelter, which means homes for people, less money for education, and it is happening before our very eyes. Then there is, of course, violence against women, which appears to be rising. We don't have historic figures for it, but it is certainly not declining. And I can tell you that it is, at least in this country, we are seeing the nature of the violence becoming more brutal. Strangulation is the first choice of forms of physical and sexual violence against women and girls in this country. Strangulation. It's no accident, of course, given rising misogyny, social media toxicity, and the fact that you can go on social media with impunity. You're not going to get pulled off. And there, the huge corporates, the Metas and so on of this world, bear an enormous responsibility for the kind of world that we're living in today. It is an arena, if I can put it that way, where hatred generally, where fascism, where conflict absolutely flourish, and where misogyny runs rampant. Approximately 1 in 3 women globally, 30% of women, have experienced physical or sexual violence in their lifetimes. Women's Aid, we had the highest number of disclosures ever last year. There have been 276 femicides, murders of women, in the South since 1996. And this third figure that I'm going to quote is deeply shocking for me. Domestic violence experienced by pregnant women presenting in Irish hospitals is up 60% over the past 3 years, 60%. A word about reproductive rights. We know that that is always hugely problematic for women. But I want to say that there is a very real danger for us at the moment. We have to maintain and expand women's reproductive rights, especially the human right to abortion. And Trump's Supreme Court, I'm calling it Trump's Supreme Court because that's what it is, really set the ball rolling and had a huge global impact on the continent, everywhere, on the continent of Africa and also here in Europe, where several countries have introduced further restrictions on abortion access, and where Poland, Malta, Liechtenstein, and I think it's Luxembourg or San Marino, still have effective total abortion bans. There is a big chink of light here, however, quite apart from ourselves, where the European Parliament just the other day in the gender equality strategy actually determined that the European Union should consider violence against women as a crime right across the European Union. It's disgraceful, that's not always the case. But also where they have said that safe, legal abortion is a fundamental human right. And that is a major step forward for the European Union Parliament, and I think it is absolutely to be welcomed, and it is entirely due to do with women's organising, mobilising, and they're out there on social media and on the streets everywhere, and I think that's very, very important. But we have to be very vigilant. We do have some cover here in Ireland because our gains have been so recent. But the government here has stalled completely on introducing even the relatively modest recommendations that were in the Abortion Law Review report. So they went that far and then they stepped right back. And actually, it's really very interesting. It used to be long ago, nobody ever mentioned the word abortion. It didn't happen in a newspaper on a front page until 2016. I have the cutting, I can prove it to you. They've stopped using the word again. They started calling it repeal. Repeal of what? It's a bit like saying violence against women. Violence by whom against women? Where did the men go? No gender, no responsibility, no nothing. Well, just watch that word repeal. I like that word repeal. I think it's great. But actually, what we were repealing was something very specific. It was a prohibition against women's fundamental human rights and freedoms. So let's be very careful. I would say nowhere is safe. What you gain can all too sadly be taken away, which is a very tough thing to learn. I want to say a very quick word about disabled women, about women and disability, because although we have a European pillar of human rights, which stresses all kinds of good things, that people with disabilities have the right to income support that ensures living in dignity, services that enable them to participate in the labour market, and so on and so forth. That's not what's actually happening on the ground, as any woman, or indeed any man with disabilities, will tell you. And it's absolutely not what we're doing here. I was at a recent seminar, a great seminar, which was organised by Disabled Women Ireland, which I actually happen to be a member of, which was looking at the high cost of disability for women in this country. It costs you more. You pay much more because you have a disability. And the figure that was quoted, which shocked me, is that 25% of disabled women here in Ireland live in poverty, which is compared with 5% of the overall population. That's appalling. That is disgraceful. We talk about it, but we don't do anything about it. And that is a fundamental. Disabled people have a right, an absolute right, to be able to live to the full of their health. Having a disability does not take away that right. You should be able to participate fully in the society and in everything that it has to offer you in your flourishing. But that is not happening. And I think it's something we need to pay much more attention to when we're speaking about health and well-being and women. We're nearly there. You with me still? Okay. I want to say a word about care. Unrecognised, unending, undervalued, low-paid, unpaid women. That's a pretty accurate description of care work the world over. We couldn't survive without care. We couldn't. Think of our hospitals, think of our education system, think of anything, think of our home, think of our communities. Just think. Without the care that women give, that women do, unending, undervalued, unpaid, and so on and so forth, it wouldn't happen. In her brilliant book, Labours of Love, The Crisis of Care, Madeleine Bunting says, care is the feminist issue. It profoundly shapes women's lives at home and at work. And the gendered pattern of care holds true globally. And while the experience differs according to your context, it remains all but impossible for any woman to entirely escape from it. It is a huge burden that women continue to carry on our shoulders. And war, militarization, rising poverty, resurgent misogyny and racism make it all the more acute. And finally, as COP30 rolls on in Brazil, we're not holding our breath for much progress, but as it rolls on, even as we are here today, I want to end with a word about climate and environmental crisis. We know who pays the highest price of climate change and environmental crisis. The consequences invariably hit those who have not caused it the very hardest, and those who have least. And surprise, surprise, that is women and marginalized communities everywhere, but most especially in the global south. Climate change multiplies threats. It makes existing inequalities much, much worse. Poverty, hardship, famine, migration. It impacts all aspects of people's lives: housing, transport, food security, jobs, health, areas where women carry the heaviest burden. So I say the climate fight is a feminist fight, And it is also an anti-racist fight, a queer, a socialist, an anti-capitalist fight. And it should be one of the key themes of the Irish presidency of the European Union this coming year. This is all about all of our lives and all of our futures. To conclude, what do we need to do? They're grim times. I've rarely known times to be so dangerous, but as a wonderful activist from the north side of Dublin, the late Kathleen O'Neill, who died just last year, used to say to me long ago, Ailbhe, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And indeed, it reminds me of what a wonderful Black American activist and writer, June Jordan, said. We must not sit inside our sorrows. We need to get cracking. We need to get up and get out there. So this is the time, very definitely, for strategic thinking, to know what's going on, to face up to it, and to plan how we confront it. It's a time for building unity. We know that we are stronger in our groups and in our communities. We know that we can bring about change. We remember that solidarity isn't just an idea or a word. We have to give it life and meaning and reality to the actions that we take together. And of course, that's where hope comes from the doing. Hope is not a thing. It doesn't drop miraculously out of a deep blue sky, if we ever have one of those ever again. We make it. We make hope as we work for change, as we research and network and organize and challenge and protest and build and march and beat our drums and do all the things that we do. That's how we make hope. It's the sitting inside our sorrows that kills hope. It's the getting up and saying, I'll get out there and I will do something. So I say that we need to be vigilant. We need to be strategic. We need to be determined. We need to be united. We need to be action-focused. And if we are all of those things, at least some of the time, we will be hopeful. Our wonderful new president says we need a new republic. I think myself we need a revolution, or at the very least, to be blessed by the goddess of rebellion in all that we do. We need to hold on to our feminist and socialist and anti-racist and everything else values and principles. And we need to fight the good fight in our own particular ways, according to our skills and our capacities for the health, for the well-being, the equality and the flourishing of everyone who lives in this world together. Thank you very much.